Hello, welcome back to another evening of shared stories and mysteries. Tonight we're diving into the theories that will absolutely wreck you emotionally. Not just the dark predictions or the twisted possibilities, but the ones that hurt because we've spent years caring about these characters. Whether you're someone who's been analysing every frame of the Season 5 trailer, or just a fan who's dreading saying goodbye to Hawkins, there's loads of heartbreaking theories to explore tonight. And I'll be covering the ones that have the most evidence and the most devastating implications, but there's definitely more theories to come in future videos. So grab your tissues, get comfortable under your blanket, and prepare yourself for some properly painful predictions. If you like what I do here and want a way to support the channel, consider subscribing down below. But for now, let's begin. So the first theory that'll properly break your heart centers on the character who's already died once, already been to hell, and might have to make the ultimate sacrifice one more time. I'm talking about Jim Hopper. Hopper's entire arc across 5 seasons has been about redemption. Not the flashy kind where someone makes a grand speech and everything's forgiven, but the slow, painful kind, where you wake up every day and try to be better than you were yesterday. And what's he been trying to redeem himself for? Losing his daughter Sarah to cancer. That's the wound that defines everything about him. His drinking, his recklessness, his initial refusal to believe Joyce about Will's disappearance. All of it stems from the fact that he couldn't save his little girl. Think about how Season 1 positioned Hopper. He was suicidal, basically. That scene where he's sitting in his trailer, pills on the table, staring at nothing. The scene where he deliberately provokes a fight he knows he'll lose. He wasn't just grieving, he was done. He'd given up. And then Will Byers went missing and Joyce Byers refused to accept that her son was dead. And something in Hopper recognised a second chance when he saw it. He couldn't save Sarah, but maybe, just maybe, he could save Will. That redemption arc continued through Season 2 when he essentially adopted Eleven. He took this traumatised, powerful girl into his cabin, taught her how to be a person, how to have boundaries, how to live in the world. He became her father in every way that mattered, and in doing so, he got to experience fatherhood again, got to protect a child again, got to matter to someone again in the way he'd mattered to Sarah. Season 3 is where the foreshadowing really starts getting heavy. Hopper's letter to Eleven, the one he never got to read to her before everything went sideways at Starcourt Mall, reads like a goodbye. Not just to childhood, which is what he claims it's about, but to life itself. He talks about being scared of change, about feeling like he's running out of time, about not knowing how to hold on to the people he loves without crushing them. That's not the language of someone planning to stick around. That's the language of someone who knows, on some level, that his time is limited. And then he died at the end of Season 3, sacrificing himself to close the gate and stop the mind flayer. Except we all knew he wasn't really dead because the post-credits scene showed a Russian prison with guards referring to the American. But here's what's interesting about that fake death. It was heroic. It was Hopper finally doing what he'd always wanted to do, protecting the people he loved at the cost of his own life. It was redemption, completed, but then they brought him back. Season 4 showed us what happened to Hopper after Starcourt. He was captured by the Russians, thrown into a brutal labour camp, forced to fight a Demogorgon for sport, tortured both physically and psychologically. The Hopper who escaped that prison is not the same man who died in Season 3. He's more broken, more traumatised, more aware of his own mortality. David Harbour has said in interviews that the Russia storyline fundamentally changed Hopper, that the experience stripped away whatever illusions he had left about his own invincibility. So why bring him back at all if his redemption arc was already complete? Why put him through the additional trauma of Russian imprisonment? The theory, and it's one that makes loads of sense when you look at the evidence, is that the Duffers brought Hopper back so they could kill him properly, this time, so they could give him a real death, a final death, one that actually sticks and actually completes his journey. Here's the thing about Hopper's relationship with Joyce. They've been dancing around each other for 5 seasons now. The attraction has always been there, the connection has always been there, but circumstances kept pulling them apart. Bob's death in Season 2 was too fresh for Joyce to move on immediately. The end of Season 3 separated them before they could really begin. Season 4 brought them back together, had them fighting side by side in Russia, had them finally acknowledging what they mean to each other. And in storytelling, when two characters who've been kept apart finally get together, when they finally admit their feelings and start building something real, that's usually a setup for tragedy, because the audience needs to feel what they have before they can properly grieve what's lost. Joyce and Hopper getting together in Season 5, maybe even getting engaged or married, would give fans exactly what they've wanted for years. But it would also make Hopper's death absolutely devastating. Joyce has already lost Bob, who died saving her and the kids. She's already lost Hopper once, or thought she had. Losing him again, this time permanently, this time right after they finally allowed themselves to be happy together, would break her. And it would break us watching it happen. Multiple fans have pointed out the pattern of father figures in Stranger Things. Bob died heroically in Season 2. Hopper died heroically in Season 3. The show has established that the price of protecting these kids is often death. That the adults who step up, who fight the monsters, who put themselves between the children and the darkness, frequently don't survive the experience. If that pattern holds, and there's no reason to think it won't, then Hopper is marked for death. There's also the question of what Hopper's survival would mean for his character arc. He's already been to hell. He's already sacrificed himself once. He's already done the hero's journey, death and resurrection included. What's left for him narratively? Settling down with Joyce in a rebuilt Hawkins? Opening that restaurant he joked about? Living a quiet domestic life after everything he's been through? That's not how these stories work. That's not how tragedy works. The hero who gets everything he wants, who survives and gets the girl, and gets to live happily ever after, that's a character whose arc feels incomplete. Because the whole point of Hopper's journey has been about learning to let go, about accepting loss, about making peace with the fact that sometimes love means sacrifice. To be honest, the most narratively satisfying ending for Hopper would involve him making a conscious choice to die. Not being killed by Vecna or a Demogorgon or Russian soldiers, but choosing to sacrifice himself to save Joyce and the kids, choosing to close the gates or destroy the Upside Down or stop Vecna, knowing it will cost him his life. That's redemption completed. That's the father who couldn't save his daughter, finally saving the children he's adopted as his own. The specific circumstances of how this might play out are debatable. Some theories suggest Hopper will have to stay behind in the Upside Down to seal it from the inside. Others think he'll take a fatal wound protecting Joyce during the final battle. Still others believe he'll make a deal with Vecna, trading his life for someone else's. The details don't matter as much as the outcome. Hopper dies, Joyce survives, Eleven survives, Will, Jonathan, the whole makeshift family he's built survives. And they survive because he didn't. Fun fact, David Harbour himself has commented on Hopper's arc in ways that suggest he's prepared for this ending. He's talked about how Hopper's journey is fundamentally about learning to be a father again, about overcoming his trauma surrounding Sarah's death, by protecting these other children. He's mentioned that the Russia storyline was about Hopper confronting his own darkness, his own capacity for violence and rage, and coming out the other side, still capable of love. That sounds like an actor who's thought deeply about how his character's story ends, and who's made peace with that ending being tragic. There's also something poetic about Hopper's potential death mirroring Sarah's in reverse. Sarah died slowly, from cancer, and there was nothing Hopper could do to stop it. He was powerless, watching his daughter fade while he stood by, helplessly. But if Hopper dies protecting Eleven and the others, if he dies quickly and heroically doing something that actually matters, then in a way he's rewriting that narrative. He's proving that he can save a child, that he can be the father he wished he'd been able to be for Sarah, even if it costs him everything. The emotional impact on the other characters would be massive. 11 has already lost one father figure in the form of Dr. Brenner, who was abusive and controlling, but still the closest thing she had to a parent for most of her childhood. Losing Hopper, who taught her what real parental love looks like, would devastate her, but it would also complete her journey toward independence, toward becoming someone who doesn't need a protector anymore, who's learned enough from Hopper to protect herself and others. Joyce losing Hopper would be the cruelest loss of all. She's already lost so much. Her marriage fell apart. Bob died in her arms. She had to move her family away from Hawkins, away from everything familiar, to keep her sons safe. And just when she's finally allowing herself to love again, to believe that maybe she can have something good in her life, Hopper would be taken from her. That's not just sad, that's properly brutal. But it's also honest. It's the kind of honest storytelling that the Duffers have always excelled at. They've never pretended that fighting monsters doesn't cost something. They've never suggested that heroism is easy or that good people are protected by plot armor. Bob died, Billy died, Eddie died. Supporting characters have been dropping throughout the series to remind us that the stakes are real, that the danger is legitimate, that not everyone makes it out alive. Hopper dying would elevate that pattern to a new level because he's not a supporting character. He's been there since the pilot. He's one of the faces of the show. His death would hurt in a way that supporting character deaths don't, no matter how beloved those supporting characters were. It would signal that absolutely no one is safe, that the final season is playing for keeps, that victory will come at a price viewers weren't prepared to pay. Whether Hopper dies saving Joyce specifically, or dies saving 11, or dies closing the gates, or dies in some other heroic last stand, the outcome is probably the same. Jim Hopper is not going to survive Stranger Things Season 5. He's going to die doing what he's been trying to do since his daughter passed away. He's going to save a child. He's going to be the father he always wished he could have been. And he's going to prove that love doesn't mean holding on. Sometimes it means letting go. That's not random. That's his entire character arc. Hopper dying to save his makeshift family would complete his journey from broken man to hero. But it would also mean Joyce loses another person she loves, and 11 loses another father, and Hawkins loses its protector. That's the kind of tragedy that serves the story. That's the kind of loss that feels earned rather than cheap. And that's why when all the evidence is laid out, when all the foreshadowing is examined, when all the narrative threads are followed to their logical conclusion, Hopper's death feels less like a theory and more like an inevitability. But Hopper's not the only parent figure whose fate looks properly grim. There's another character who's been positioned for heartbreak since the very beginning, someone whose love has been both her greatest strength and her most devastating vulnerability. Let's talk about Joyce Byers, because her story might end in the most heartbreaking way possible. Joyce has been the emotional core of Stranger Things since the pilot. She's the one who refused to believe Will was dead when everyone else had given up. She's the one who communicated with her son through Christmas lights and painted alphabets on the wall. She's the mother who literally went to another dimension to bring her child home. And across 5 seasons, the show has rewarded that fierce maternal love by putting her through absolute hell. Season 1, she lost her son to the Upside Down and spent a week being told she was crazy, hysterical, unable to accept reality. Season 2, she had to watch Will be possessed by the Mind Flayer, had to perform a makeshift exorcism on her own child, had to see him in agony and know she was the one causing it because it was the only way to save him. Season 3, she finally let herself love Bob Newby, this sweet, earnest man who adored her and her boys, and then she had to watch him get torn apart by demodogs while he sacrificed himself to save them all. Also in Season 3, she thought Hopper died. The man she'd been circling around for years, the one she'd finally started to trust, to lean on, to maybe even love, gone in an explosion at Starcourt Mall. Season 4 brought the relief of discovering Hopper was alive, but at the cost of having to infiltrate a Russian prison, fight her way through armed guards and monsters, and drag him out of literal hell. That's a lot of trauma for one person. That's more than most people could survive and remain functional. And Joyce has survived it, but only barely, and only because she's had to, because her sons need her, because the fight isn't over, because giving up isn't an option when the world keeps threatening the people she loves. But there's a limit to how much one person can endure. And the theory that's been gaining traction, particularly among fans who've been analysing Joyce's arc across all 5 seasons, is that Season 5 will push her past that limit. Not because she stops being strong, but because the universe finally asks for one sacrifice too many. The most devastating version of this theory involves Joyce being forced to choose, specifically to choose between saving Will or saving Hopper. Imagine that scenario playing out in the final battle. Vecna has Will, is using him as a vessel or a hostage or both. Hopper is dying from wounds he sustained protecting everyone. And Joyce, who spent 5 seasons refusing to choose, refusing to prioritize one loved one over another, suddenly has to. She can save her son, the child she's fought for since the beginning, or she can save the man she loves, the partner who stood beside her through everything. There's no right answer. There's no choice that doesn't destroy her. Save Will and Hopper dies, and she has to live with the knowledge that she let it happen, that she chose. Save Hopper and Will dies, and she loses the child she's moved heaven and earth to protect. Either way, she's broken. Some versions of this theory suggest she makes the choice, and then has to live with the consequences in whatever epilogue we get. Others suggest she can't make the choice, freezes in the moment, and loses both of them because of her hesitation. Still others think she'll try to sacrifice herself instead, to save both Will and Hopper by offering herself in their place, only to have one of them stop her, make the choice for her, die so she doesn't have to choose at all. What's really interesting is how this would parallel Will's original disappearance. In Season 1, Joyce's entire journey was about refusing to accept loss, about fighting against everyone who told her to let go, to move on, to accept that Will was gone. She proved them all wrong. She brought her son home through sheer force of will and maternal love. But if Season 5 forces her to accept loss, to let go of someone she loves, to acknowledge that not everyone can be saved no matter how hard you fight, that would complete her arc in the most painful way imaginable. It would also be honest about what trauma does to people. Joyce has been running on adrenaline and desperation for years. She's held her family together through impossibilities, but that kind of strength isn't infinite. Eventually, something breaks. And showing Joyce breaking, showing her reaching the limit of what she can endure, would be true to the show's realistic portrayal of psychological damage. Winona Ryder has mentioned in interviews that playing Joyce has been emotionally exhausting. She's talked about how each season requires her to access deeper levels of fear and grief, how Joyce's trauma is cumulative, building on itself until the character is barely holding on. That sounds like an actress who understands where her character is headed, who's been preparing for an ending that's less about triumph and more about the cost of survival. There's another version of this theory that's somehow even darker. What if Joyce doesn't have to choose between Will and Hopper because the choice is already made for her? What if one of them dies early in the season, and Joyce spends the rest of the finale fighting to save the other, fighting to not lose twice, fighting to keep, at least, one person she loves alive? The psychological weight of that scenario, the trauma of losing one, and then having to keep functioning, keep fighting, keep being strong for whoever remains, would be absolutely brutal to watch. To be honest, Joyce dying herself, sacrificing her life to save both her sons and Hopper, makes a different kind of narrative sense. She's already proven she'll do anything for the people she loves. She's already shown she values their lives more than her own. A final sacrifice, one where she consciously chooses to give up her life so they can have theirs, would complete her arc as the ultimate protector, the mother whose love literally saved the world. The impact on the other characters would be devastating in ways that ripple through the entire cast. Will and Jonathan, losing their mother after everything she's done for them, would be cruel beyond measure. They've leaned on her strength their entire lives. She's been their constant, their safe place, their proof that someone will always fight for them. Losing her would leave a wound that never fully heals. Hopper losing Joyce right after finding her again would destroy him. He's already lost one love of his life in Sarah. Having Joyce taken from him too, potentially dying in his arms, the way Bob died in hers, would be poetic in the worst possible way. It would prove that Hopper's curse isn't just bad luck, it's that everyone he loves eventually leaves him, one way or another. 11 would lose the closest thing she's had to a maternal figure. Joyce has always been kind to Elle, always treated her like a person, rather than a weapon or a freak. In Season 3, when Elle lost her powers and felt useless, Joyce was there offering comfort and normalcy. Joyce represented what family could be, what a mother could be. Losing that would hit Elle almost as hard as losing Hopper. Multiple fans have pointed out that Joyce's name itself might be foreshadowing. James Joyce wrote about exile, loss, and the impossibility of truly going home. The literary reference might be the Duffer's way of signalling that Joyce Byers will be exiled from her happy ending, that she'll lose her home either literally or metaphorically, that her story was always going to be about what gets sacrificed in the name of love. There's also the question of what Joyce surviving would actually look like. If Hopper dies, if Will is traumatized beyond repair, if Hawkins is destroyed and everyone has to start over somewhere new, what kind of life does Joyce have? She'd be even more broken than she already is, more haunted, more lost. Maybe death is actually the kinder ending. Maybe the most tragic thing the show could do is let her survive, but take away everything that made survival worthwhile. The pattern across Stranger Things has always been that mothers sacrifice for their children. Karen Wheeler remains oblivious, safely removed from danger. Mrs. Sinclair is protective, but uninvolved. Claudia Henderson is sweet, but clueless. But Joyce throws herself into the fire repeatedly. She breaks the pattern of safe, uninvolved mothers by being the opposite, by being present, active, willing to die for her kids if necessary. And in stories like this, the character who's willing to die for others is usually the one who has to, because their willingness becomes fate, because their love becomes liability, because the universe always collects on debts like that eventually. Whether Joyce dies making an impossible choice, or dies sacrificing herself to avoid that choice, or survives but loses everything anyway, one thing feels increasingly certain. Joyce Byers will not get a happy ending. She'll get an honest one. She'll get an ending that acknowledges the price of love, the cost of fighting, the reality that sometimes being strong enough to survive isn't the same as being happy enough to want to. Joyce Byers has been the heart of this show from the beginning. She's the one who never stopped believing, never gave up, never let the world tell her she was crazy for fighting for her son. If the show takes her away in the final season, or breaks her completely, it would be absolutely devastating. But it would also honour everything she's fought for by showing that her love saved her children, even if she couldn't save herself. And maybe that's the only ending that makes sense for a character who's always put everyone else first. Speaking of characters who've been protecting others at great personal cost, there's one member of the party whose sacrifice has been building since Season 1, and whose fate in Season 5 might force the most impossible decision any of them have faced. Mike Wheeler started this entire journey by refusing to give up on finding his missing friend, and he might end it by having to choose which person he loves gets to survive. Mike's character has always been defined by loyalty. In Season 1, when everyone else was ready to accept that Will had drowned, Mike kept searching. When the adults told them to stop, to go home, to let the professionals handle it, Mike organised the party to keep looking. When 11 appeared and needed help, Mike took her in without hesitation. His entire identity is built around protecting the people he cares about, around refusing to accept loss, around believing that if you fight hard enough, you can save everyone. But Season 5 might finally force him to confront the reality that you can't always save everyone, that sometimes heroism means making choices that destroy you. The theory centers on Mike being trapped between Elle and Will during the final confrontation with Vecna. Not a love triangle in the romantic sense, though that element has always been there, simmering beneath the surface, but rather a situation where saving one person means losing the other, and Mike, as the leader of the party, as the one everyone looks to for decisions, has to make the call. Imagine the scenario. Vecna has possessed Will, is using him as a vessel or a gateway or both. 11 is the only one powerful enough to stop Vecna, but stopping him means potentially killing Will in the process. Or alternatively, 11 is dying, her powers burning her out from the inside, and the only way to save her is to let Vecna keep Will, to abandon the rescue attempt, to accept that Will is lost. Mike would be the one making that decision, not because he wants to, not because he's qualified to, but because that's what leaders do. They make impossible choices so others don't have to. If Mike chooses to save Elle, he loses his best friend, the person he's known since kindergarten, the kid who was there for every important moment of his childhood. Will disappearing in Season 1 broke something in Mike, and getting him back fixed it. Losing Will again, this time permanently, this time because Mike actively chose to let it happen, would be a betrayal Mike could never forgive himself for. If Mike chooses to save Will, he loses the girl he loves, the person who's shown him what it means to care about someone more than yourself. Elle has been Mike's whole world since Season 1. Their relationship has survived distance, lies, arguments, and interdimensional threats. Losing her, watching her die because Mike decided Will was more important, would hollow Mike out from the inside. There's no version of this choice that doesn't destroy him. What's really interesting is how this scenario has been building across the entire series. Mike has spent 5 seasons trying to maintain both relationships, trying to be there for Will, while also being there for Elle. And the show has consistently put pressure on that balancing act. Season 3 had Will feeling abandoned when Mike spent all his time with Elle. Season 4 had Mike struggling with long distance, while Will was right there beside him, loyal as always, carrying feelings he couldn't express. The tension has always been there, the question of who Mike would choose if forced to choose, and Season 5 might finally answer it. Finn Wolfhard has mentioned in interviews that Mike's arc in the final season is about growing up, about moving from the kid who wants to save everyone to the young man who understands that some things are beyond saving. That's not the kind of comment you make about a character who's going to get an easy, happy resolution. That's the kind of comment you make about a character who's going to have to make a choice that changes them fundamentally. There's also the Dungeons and Dragons parallel that's been present since the pilot. In the game, party leaders have to make strategic decisions about who to save and who to sacrifice. They have to think tactically, prioritize objectives, accept losses in service of the larger mission. Mike has always been the dungeon master, the one running the campaigns, the one making those calls in the safety of a game. But Season 5 will force him to make those calls for real, with actual lives at stake, with actual consequences he has to live with forever. The impact on Mike's character would be massive regardless of which choice he makes. If he saves Elle, he becomes the person who abandoned his best friend. If he saves Will, he becomes the person who let the girl he loves die. Either way, he loses his innocence, his belief that heroism means saving everyone, his faith that being brave and loyal and good is enough. And honestly, that's the kind of character development that a final season needs. Mike has been too protected, too central, too essential to the group's survival. He's never had to make a choice that truly cost him something irreplaceable. Forcing him into this position would give his arc the weight it's been lacking, would show that leadership isn't about making the right choices, it's about living with the consequences of the choices you make. The rest of the party would be affected too. Dustin, Lucas, Max, they'd all have to watch Mike make this decision. They'd see him break under the pressure of it, and they'd know that any of them might have to make similar choices before the end. It would shatter the group's last remaining innocence, the belief that if they stick together and fight hard enough, they can all make it out alive. Let's be honest, Mike has had it relatively easy compared to the others. Will was possessed, traumatized, marked by the upside down. Elle lost her powers, lost Hopper, lost her sense of self. Dustin lost Eddie. Lucas watched Max die. Max is in a coma. But Mike has suffered, sure, but he's never had to sacrifice something that couldn't be recovered. He's never had to make a choice he couldn't take back. Season 5 changes that. Whether Mike saves Elle and lives with the guilt of losing Will, or saves Will and lives with the grief of losing Elle, or finds some third option that costs him something else entirely, one thing is clear. Mike Wheeler is not walking away from this finale unchanged. He's not going to be the kid who believes in happy endings anymore. He's going to be the person who knows exactly how much those endings cost, who paid the price personally, who carries the weight of impossible choices. The theory suggests that whichever choice Mike makes will define the ending of the entire series, because Mike has always been the audience surrogate, the normal kid in extraordinary circumstances, the one whose reactions mirror our own. If Mike breaks, if Mike has to choose, if Mike loses someone he loves because of a decision he made, then we as viewers experience that loss viscerally. We feel the weight of it because Mike is the one carrying it. Fun fact, the Duffers have said that Stranger Things was always going to end with the party fractured in some way, changed by what they've experienced, unable to go back to being the kids they were. Mike being forced to choose between Elle and Will would fracture the party more effectively than any monster could. It would create a rift that couldn't be healed, a loss that couldn't be undone, a change that couldn't be reversed. That's not a choice any teenager should have to make, but that's exactly why the story needs to force him into it. Because Stranger Things has always been about kids facing adult problems, about childhood ending too soon, about the moment you realize the world is crueler than you thought, and love doesn't always save people, and sometimes being a hero just means surviving long enough to hate yourself for what you had to do. Mike Wheeler has always been the heart of the party, the one who brings everyone together, who refuses to accept loss. Forcing him to choose between the two most important people in his life would be cruel. It would be unfair. And it would be exactly the kind of Sophie's Choice moment that a final season needs to have real emotional weight. Because easy victories don't mean anything. Only the choices that break you matter in the end. But Mike might not be the only one facing an impossible decision. There's another character whose bond with someone has defined them for years, and whose loss would devastate not just the characters, but the entire fan base. Since we're on the topic of heartbreaking losses, let's talk about the friendship that's meant everything to fans, and might end in the most devastating way possible. I'm talking about Dustin and Steve. Their relationship is one of the show's best developments, a friendship that nobody saw coming, but everyone fell in love with. When Season 2 paired the popular reformed jock with the nerdy kid with no front teeth, it shouldn't have worked. But it did. Steve became Dustin's older brother figure, his protector, his friend, in a way that transcended their age difference and social status. And Dustin gave Steve purpose, showed him that being cool wasn't as important as being kind, that protecting kids was more heroic than winning fights or impressing girls. By Season 3, they had their own language. Henderson and Harrington, the Scoops Troop dynamic. Steve driving Dustin to the snowball, giving him hair advice, treating him like he mattered. It was pure and sweet and genuine, the kind of friendship that reminded viewers why they loved this show in the first place. Season 4 took that dynamic and made it even more important, because that's when Dustin found Eddie, another older brother figure, another person who saw him and accepted him and made him feel like he belonged. And then Eddie died in Dustin's arms, bleeding out from demobat wounds, while Dustin sobbed and told him he was a hero. Dustin lost someone who understood him, who made him feel cool and brave and capable. The grief of that loss was visible in every scene Dustin had for the rest of the season. Now imagine him losing Steve too. The theory that Steve dies saving Dustin specifically has loads of evidence supporting it. Steve's entire arc since season 2 has been about redemption through protection. He's the babysitter, the guy with the nail bat, the one who puts himself between the kids and danger without hesitation. Every season features at least one moment where Steve takes a beating or risks his life to keep the younger characters safe. It's what defines him now. It's his purpose. And in storytelling, when a character's purpose is that clearly defined, that consistently reinforced, the narrative usually requires them to fulfill that purpose completely. Steve's arc has been building toward the ultimate act of protection, the final sacrifice that proves he's become the person he was always meant to be. Dying to save Dustin would complete that transformation from season 1's shallow bully to season 5's genuine hero. There's also the trailer footage that's got everyone worried. That shot of Dustin hugging Steve with tears streaming down his face. Dustin looks absolutely devastated, clinging to Steve like he's afraid to let go. Fans have interpreted this as Dustin mourning Steve's death, saying goodbye, processing the loss of another person who made him feel protected and valued. But here's the thing about that footage. It could mean loads of different things. Maybe Steve survives something harrowing and Dustin's crying from relief. Maybe they're separated for most of the season and this is their reunion. Maybe someone else dies and Dustin is seeking comfort from Steve. The Duffers know how to manipulate audience expectations, and that trailer shot feels almost too obvious, too pointed, which is why I reckon Steve might actually be safe. The theory is so widespread at this point, so universally accepted by the fan base, that killing Steve would feel expected rather than shocking. And the Duffers like to subvert expectations when they can, to misdirect viewers, to make them think one thing is coming and then deliver something different. But even if Steve survives, the fear of losing him is real for Dustin. And that fear, that constant awareness that the people you love can be taken away at any moment, is its own kind of trauma. Dustin has already lost Eddie. He knows what it feels like to watch someone die for him. The possibility of losing Steve too, of going through that grief again, would be hanging over every scene they share in season 5. Think about what Dustin has endured across the series. He's been attacked by demodogs, imprisoned by Russians, hunted by the town as an accused cult member, and watched Eddie Munson bleed out while guitar riffs still echoed in the air. He's suffered more than most adults could handle, and he's still just a kid. Still goofy, still optimistic, still trying to be the glue that holds the party together. But there's only so much loss one person can absorb before something fundamental breaks. Dustin losing Steve after already losing Eddie would push him past that breaking point. It would take the most emotionally resilient member of the party and shatter him completely. And showing Dustin finally unable to bounce back, unable to make jokes or lighten the mood or pretend everything will be okay, would be properly gutting to watch. Gaten Matarazzo has said in interviews that Dustin's journey in season 5 involves confronting accumulated trauma, facing losses he hasn't fully processed yet. That's not the kind of statement you make about a character who's heading toward a happy ending. That's an actor preparing audiences for his character to go through something that fundamentally changes him. The pattern of Dustin's mentor figures is also significant. Season 2 gave him Steve. Season 4 gave him Eddie. Both filled similar roles, older guys who treated Dustin like an equal, who valued his intelligence and enthusiasm, who made him feel seen. Eddie died. If Steve dies too, it establishes a devastating pattern. Everyone who gets close to Dustin, everyone who becomes that protective older brother figure, doesn't survive. That would mark Dustin as somehow cursed, someone whose love brings danger to the people who care about him. Joe Keery, who plays Steve, has been notably cagey in interviews about season 5. He hasn't confirmed or denied anything about Steve's fate. He's mentioned that Steve's arc comes to a meaningful conclusion, that the character's journey feels complete. Again, that's the kind of careful language actors use when they know something major is coming but can't spoil it. Whether Steve dies heroically, sacrificing himself for Dustin in a moment that mirrors Eddie's death, or whether he survives but Dustin has to watch him nearly die, nearly lose another person he loves, the emotional impact would be massive either way, because the relationship between Steve and Dustin represents something the show has always valued: found family, chosen bonds, the idea that the people who matter most aren't always related by blood, but by choice, by loyalty, by showing up when it counts. Steve and Dustin chose each other. Steve didn't have to befriend this kid. Dustin didn't have to look up to this former bully. But they connected anyway, built something real, created a friendship that's defined both their characters for 3 seasons. Breaking that bond, either through death or through the trauma of nearly losing each other, would hurt in ways that biological family deaths don't always hurt. To be honest, if Steve does die, Dustin's reaction will be what breaks viewers' hearts more than Steve's actual death. Because we've watched Dustin lose Eddie. We've seen how he processes grief, how he tries to be brave even when he's falling apart, how he carries the weight of survivor's guilt. Watching him go through that again, watching him realize he's lost another brother, watching him blame himself even though it's not his fault, that would be the truly devastating part. There's also the question of what Steve's death would mean for the other characters. Robin would lose her best friend, the person who accepts her completely. Nancy would lose someone she once loved and still cares about deeply. The kids would lose their protector, the one adult-adjacent figure who treated them like capable people rather than children to be shielded. But Dustin would lose the most, because Steve isn't just his friend. Steve is proof that Dustin matters, that he's worth protecting, that someone cool and brave and good sees value in him. Without Steve, without Eddie, Dustin would be left with a void that couldn't be filled, with a grief that couldn't be processed, with a loss that couldn't be accepted. Dustin Henderson has been through so much. He's lost friends, he's lost his sense of safety, and in season 4 he lost Eddie right after finding someone who truly understood him. Losing Steve too, the person who's been his big brother for years, would be the cruelest loss of all. But it would also give Steve the hero's death he's been building toward since he picked up that nail bat in season 1. It would prove that his transformation was complete, that he became someone willing to die for the people he loves. The alternative, where Steve survives but Dustin lives in constant fear of losing him, might actually be more painful, because then Dustin carries that anxiety forever, that awareness that the people he loves are fragile, that heroism is temporary, that anyone can be taken at any moment. That's not a happy ending. That's just surviving with fresh scars. Either way, Dustin and Steve's story in season 5 is going to wreck us. Whether it ends in death or in the trauma of nearly dying, whether Steve sacrifices himself or survives by luck, the bond between these two characters has always been heading toward a moment that tests it completely. And when that moment comes, when Dustin has to face the possibility of losing another person who made him feel brave and valued and loved, we're all going to need those tissues we grabbed at the beginning. But individual deaths aren't the only heartbreaking theories floating around. There's one about the entire town of Hawkins that makes everything even darker, that suggests the cost of victory might be losing the place where all these stories began. Word count verification. What if winning means losing everything? What if the only way to stop Vecna and close the gates is to make sure no one can ever return to Hawkins again? Hawkins isn't just the setting for Stranger Things. It's a character in its own right, as important to the story as any of the kids or adults fighting to protect it. The town represents childhood, safety, home. It's where these friendships were forged, where first kisses happened, where bike rides and arcade games and basement D&D campaigns created the memories that define who these characters are. Losing Hawkins wouldn't just be losing a place, it would be losing the physical embodiment of everything they've been fighting for. But the evidence suggests that might be exactly what happens. Nancy's vision, at the end of Season 4, showed Hawkins completely destroyed. Not damaged, not partially. Consumed by the Upside Down, but utterly annihilated. Buildings collapsed, streets torn apart, the sky dark and churning with ash and decay. She saw the town as a graveyard, a place where nothing living could survive. And Nancy's visions, given to her directly by Vexner, have a habit of coming true in one form or another. The gates are already tearing the town apart. By the end of Season 4, massive rifts had opened across Hawkins, splitting neighbourhoods, consuming homes, creating no-go zones where the Upside Down had bled through into reality. The government response was to establish a perimeter and evacuate civilians, but that's just buying time. The gates aren't stable. They're growing, spreading, merging together like wounds that won't heal. The theory is that the only way to permanently close those gates, to sever the connection between dimensions once and for all, is to destroy Hawkins itself. Either through some massive final battle that levels the town, or through a deliberate decision to seal the entire area, to make it uninhabitable, to ensure that whatever doorway was opened here can never be opened again. Think about the precedent the show has already established. In Season 2, they burned the tunnels beneath Hawkins to drive out the Mind Flayer's infection. Localized destruction to contain a spreading threat. In Season 3, they destroyed Starcourt Mall entirely, brought the whole structure down to close the Russian gate. Again, sacrificing a location to stop the Upside Down's invasion. Season 5 would just be scaling that pattern up to its logical conclusion. Not a mall, not a tunnel system, but the entire town. Everything goes. The school where they attended classes, the Wheeler house where campaigns were played, the arcade where high scores were chased, the quarry where they rode bikes and felt infinite, all of it sacrificed to save the world. The emotional weight of that decision would be staggering. These characters aren't just losing their homes, they're losing their history, their childhood made physical. Every street corner has a memory attached. Every building represents some moment that shaped them. Hawkins is where Will went missing and was found. Where 11 escaped the lab. Where Barb died. Where Bob sacrificed himself. Where Billy was possessed. Where Eddie played his final song. Destroying Hawkins means erasing all of those locations, turning memory into ghost, making it impossible to ever return to the places where these formative events occurred. You can't go home again, not because you've changed, but because home itself is gone. The government's involvement makes this theory even more plausible. They've been covering up Hawkins' supernatural problems for years, eliminating evidence, controlling narratives, doing whatever it takes to keep the truth contained. If the situation becomes truly unmanageable, if the gates can't be closed through conventional means, the government would absolutely consider extreme measures. Quarantine the entire town, evacuate everyone, seal it off permanently behind fences and guards and classified orders. Or worse, they might decide that sealing isn't enough, that the only way to be certain the threat is neutralized is to eliminate it completely. Military strikes, controlled detonations, turning Hawkins into a crater to make sure nothing from the Upside Down can ever escape. It sounds extreme, but Hawkins has been the site of repeated interdimensional breaches, government experiments gone wrong, and civilian casualties that can't be explained away forever. At some point, cutting losses becomes policy. There's also a symbolic dimension to Hawkins being destroyed. The show has always been about growing up, about the painful transition from childhood to adulthood, and a fundamental part of growing up is accepting that you can't return to the past, can't recapture what was, can't stay in the safe, familiar places forever. Hawkins being destroyed would literalize that metaphor. The characters would be forced to move on, not by choice but by necessity. Their childhood home would be gone, and they'd have to build new lives in new places, carrying only their memories and each other. That's bittersweet in the most painful way. They save the world, they defeat Vecna, they close the gates, but the price is that they become refugees from their own history, people without a hometown, survivors who won the battle but lost the war for normalcy. Multiple fans have pointed out that this would also resolve the question of what happens after the Upside Down is defeated. If Hawkins still exists, if it's still habitable, then what? Do the characters just go back to normal life? Pretend none of this happened? Attend school and date and worry about college applications like the trauma doesn't exist? That feels dishonest, but if Hawkins is gone, if they're scattered to different cities and states, then the ending acknowledges that you can't go back, that some experiences change you so fundamentally that the life you had before is no longer accessible. The Duffer Brothers have mentioned in interviews that Season 5's ending will feel final, that it closes doors rather than leaving them open for potential future stories. Destroying Hawkins would certainly accomplish that. There's no sequel to be told if the location where everything happened no longer exists. It's definitive, it's permanent, it's the kind of ending that stays with you because it doesn't flinch from the cost of victory. Whether Hawkins is destroyed in the final battle, consumed by the Upside Down's expansion, or deliberately eliminated by government intervention, the outcome is the same. The town where Stranger Things began will not survive the final season. The characters will win, but they'll lose their world in the process. They'll save humanity, but sacrifice their home. And they'll spend the rest of their lives carrying the memory of a place that exists now, only in their shared history, a ghost town in every sense, gone but never forgotten. Hawkins being destroyed or permanently sealed off would mean the characters save the world, but lose their world. They'd survive, but they'd be refugees from their own childhood. That's not a happy ending, but it's an honest one. Sometimes you can't go home again, not because you've changed, but because home itself is gone. And that absence, that empty space where home used to be, becomes part of who you are forever. Speaking of losses that cut deeper than death, there's a theory about a relationship that's been the emotional core of the series. A bond that might survive the final battle, only to be broken in a different, equally devastating way. Word count verification. Here's a theory that manages to be both hopeful and absolutely heartbreaking at the same time. Mike and Eleven both survive the final battle. They defeat Vecna, they close the gates, and then they have to say goodbye forever. Their relationship has been central to Stranger Things since the moment Mike found Elle in the woods during that rainy November night in 1983. She was terrified, confused, barely able to speak. He took her in, hid her in his basement, gave her a place to feel safe. From that first night, they've been connected in ways that transcend normal teenage romance. They've saved each other, repeatedly, died for each other, fought their way back to each other across distances and dimensions and obstacles that should have been insurmountable. But here's the pattern that's impossible to ignore. They've spent most of the series separated. Season 1 ended with Elle disappearing after destroying the Demogorgon, leaving Mike convinced she was dead. Season 2 kept them apart for an entire year, while Hopper hid Elle in the cabin. They reunited at the Snowball, got their dance, had their moment, but Season 3 tore them apart again when the Byers family moved to California at the end. Season 4 was all about long-distance struggle, about Mike trying to say, "I love you," and failing, about Elle feeling abandoned and Mike feeling inadequate. The show keeps pulling them apart, and the theory is that Season 5 will make that separation permanent. The most popular version involves Elle having to stay in the Upside Down to keep it sealed. She's the one who created the dimension, or at least shaped it, when she banished Vecna in 1979. Her connection to that realm is fundamental, intrinsic. Closing the gates permanently might require her to remain on the other side, to act as a living seal, to sacrifice her place in the normal world to ensure the upside down never threatens anyone again. Mike and Elle would both survive. They'd both win. But they'd lose each other in the process. Another version has Elle losing not just her powers, but her memories. The strain of defeating Vecna, of closing the gates, of using her abilities at their absolute limit, burns out something essential. She wakes up after the battle alive but blank, unable to remember Mike, unable to remember Hawkins, unable to remember any of the life she fought so hard to build. Mike would have the girl he loves standing right in front of him, but she wouldn't know who he was. She'd be a stranger wearing Elle's face. Both scenarios are more tragic than death in some ways, because death is final, clean, something you can eventually process and move on from. But knowing the person you love is alive somewhere, unreachable, or standing right there but fundamentally gone, that's a different kind of pain. That's the kind that doesn't heal. That's permanent longing with no resolution, just an empty space where a future used to be. The 80s film parallels support this theory loads. E.T. had to go home. Elliot loved him, wanted him to stay, but E.T. belonged somewhere else. Their goodbye was bittersweet, hopeful, and heartbreaking at once. The Duffers have always cited E.T. as a major influence, and Elle's journey has deliberately mirrored Elliot's in loads of ways. The found friend, the psychic connection, the government threat, the protective love. Having Elle leave like E.T. did would complete that parallel, while also subverting the audience expectation of a traditional happy ending. Millie Bobby Brown has mentioned in interviews that she sees Elle's arc as fundamentally about finding independence, about learning to be a person separate from the people who defined her, starting as a lab experiment, then becoming Hopper's daughter, then Mike's girlfriend. Each identity borrowed from someone else. If Season 5 is truly the completion of her journey, then Elle needs to become someone who exists for herself, not as a reflection of her relationships. And maybe that means leaving. Maybe that means going somewhere Mike can't follow. Somewhere she can finally discover who she is without anyone else's expectations or needs or fears shaping her. It's growth, but it's painful growth. It's the right ending for her character, but it's devastating for Mike, and for everyone watching who wants them to be together. There's also something properly devastating about the idea that they get everything they wanted except each other. They defeat the villain, save their friends, protect the world, but the price is their relationship. The cost of victory is losing the person who made the fight worthwhile. That's the kind of bittersweet ending that stays with you long after the credits roll. Whether Elle stays in another dimension, loses her memories, or simply has to leave Earth entirely to keep her powers from attracting new threats, the outcome is separation. Mike and Eleven getting their happy ending together would be lovely, but them surviving the battle only to realise they can't be together, that saving the world means sacrificing their future, would hurt in a way that death doesn't, because death is final. But knowing the person you love is alive somewhere, unreachable, that's a different kind of pain. That's the kind that lasts forever, that colours every moment after, that turns victory into something hollow. They'd have saved everything except what mattered most, and they'd spend the rest of their lives wondering if it was worth it, if winning without each other counts as winning at all. That question wouldn't have an answer. It would just sit there, heavy and permanent, a reminder that sometimes love isn't enough, and heroism costs more than you can afford to pay. But there's an even more controversial theory about how the finale handles loss. One that suggests Season 5 won't just break our hearts once, but repeatedly, in rapid succession, giving us no time to recover before the next blow lands. What if the finale doesn't just kill one beloved character? What if it kills 3 or 4 in rapid succession, giving us no time to process before the next loss hits? Stranger Things has maintained a pattern across 4 seasons that's kept the main cast remarkably safe. Supporting characters die, sometimes beloved ones like Bob, or Alexi, or Eddie, but the core group has stayed intact. Mike, Eleven, Will, Dustin, Lucas, Max, Nancy, Jonathan, Steve, Robin, Joyce, Hopper. They've all survived, sometimes barely, sometimes at great cost, but they've survived. For a show about kids fighting interdimensional monsters and government conspiracies, the survival rate has been unrealistically high. Season 5 needs to break that pattern if the stakes are going to feel real. The theory is that the final battle won't just claim one life, it'll be a massacre. Multiple main characters dying in quick succession, each death hitting before we've had time to grieve the last one. No breathing room, no safety, no plot armor protecting anyone, just because they've been there since the beginning. The kind of brutal rapid-fire loss that shows the audience this is war, not adventure. And war has casualties that don't care about narrative importance or fan favourites. Think about how other major finales have handled this. Avengers Endgame killed Iron Man and Black Widow. Game of Thrones, for all its faults in the final season, killed loads of major characters in the Battle of Winterfell. Harry Potter's final book featured deaths of beloved characters throughout the climactic battle. The pattern across epic finales is that when the stakes are highest, when everything is on the line, people die. Multiple people. Important people. The Duffer Brothers have promised that Season 5 will be brutal, that deaths will serve the story rather than existing for shock value. Multiple cast members have echoed this in interviews. Gaten Matarazzo said he thinks one of the kids needs to die for the ending to have proper impact. Maya Hawke mentioned that real consequences are necessary. Even Millie Bobby Brown has said she'd understand if Eleven died, if it made narrative sense. When the actors themselves are preparing fans for major deaths, you know something massive is coming. The question is who? And the theory suggests it's not one person, but several. Candidates include Jonathan, whose character has been somewhat sidelined in recent seasons, and whose heroic death would affect multiple core characters. Nancy, whose visions of destruction might be foreshadowing her own fate. Steve, whose redemption arc has been building toward ultimate sacrifice. Lucas, whose devotion to Max has positioned him for potential tragedy. Even Joyce or Hopper, either or both, completing their arcs through final acts of protection. The strategy behind killing multiple characters in one sequence is psychological. The first death shocks the audience. The second one proves the first wasn't a fluke, that anyone can die. The third shatters any remaining illusion of safety. By the fourth, viewers are in genuine terror about who else might not survive. It removes all predictability, all comfort, all certainty that beloved characters will make it through simply because we love them. It would also force the surviving characters to process multiple losses simultaneously, which is closer to how real trauma works. You don't get time to properly grieve one person before the next crisis hits. You carry multiple griefs at once, each one compounding the others, each loss making the next one hit harder because you're already depleted, already broken, already operating on empty. Let's be honest about the plot armor problem. Stranger Things has been great at making us fear for characters' lives in the moment, but ultimately, very few major characters have actually died. That undermines tension after a while. Once viewers realize the main cast is essentially untouchable, that the show will kill supporting characters, but never the core group, the fear dissipates. Deaths start feeling like they're happening to characters we met this season rather than characters we've loved for years. Season 5 killing multiple main cast members would shatter that complacency immediately. It would prove that being important to the story, being beloved by fans, having unfinished character arcs, none of that guarantees survival. It would make every scene where characters are in danger genuinely terrifying, because we'd know the show has already proven it's willing to take anyone. The emotional devastation would be staggering. Imagine a sequence where Jonathan dies protecting Nancy, and before she's had time to process that, Steve dies protecting Dustin, and before Dustin can grieve, Joyce or Hopper fall, and suddenly we've lost 3 or 4 major characters in the span of 20 minutes. The audience wouldn't have time to cry properly for any of them individually. The grief would be cumulative, overwhelming, the kind that leaves you numb rather than cathartic. And that numbness might be the point. That might be what the Duffers want us to feel, what the surviving characters would feel. Not clean grief with clear stages and eventual acceptance, but the overwhelming chaos of too much loss happening too fast, the inability to process because you're still in survival mode, still fighting, still trying to make it through the next 5 minutes. Fun fact, the cast has mentioned crying while reading the final scripts, not just getting emotional, but actual tears, multiple times. That level of reaction suggests more than one death, more than one goodbye. It suggests a finale that's relentlessly brutal, that doesn't give anyone, characters or viewers, a moment to catch their breath. Whether it's Jonathan and Nancy, Steve and Robin, Joyce and Hopper, or some other combination of beloved characters, the pattern of multiple rapid deaths would fundamentally change how the finale feels. It would transform the final battle from a heroic last stand into a desperate scramble for survival. It would show that defeating Vecna isn't a clean victory, with casualties neatly contained. It's messy and awful, and costs far more than anyone wanted to pay. The survivors would be left with a victory that feels hollow. They saved the world, yes. They closed the gates, stopped the upside down, protected humanity, but the price was watching multiple friends and family members die in front of them. The cost was grief so overwhelming they'll spend years trying to process it. The result is trauma that never fully heals, just scars over, leaving permanent marks on who they become. No one is safe, not anymore. Multiple main character deaths in the finale would be devastating. It would break our hearts repeatedly, but it would also make the victory feel earned, make the sacrifice feel real, and make the story honest about the cost of fighting monsters. Sometimes heroism means dying, and sometimes it means watching the people you love die while you keep fighting. Both hurt in ways that change you forever, in ways that ensure you never forget what this war actually cost. Beyond individual fates, though, there are theories about how the entire story concludes, about what the final images will be, about whether anyone gets anything resembling peace after everything they've endured. The finale episode airs on December 31st, New Year's Eve, and there's a theory about why that date is significant that'll absolutely wreck you. New Year's Eve represents endings and beginnings, the moment when one chapter closes and another opens. It's symbolic of transition, of leaving the past behind, of moving forward into uncertainty with hope that things might be better. The Duffers chose that air date deliberately, which means the finale's themes will almost certainly revolve around those ideas, about what ends, what begins, and what gets left behind in between. The theory centres on an epilogue set years after the main battle, 5 years, maybe 10, enough time that the characters have aged, changed, built new lives in the aftermath of whatever happened in Hawkins. We'd see them as adults or near adults, gathered together for the first time since the finale, coming back to remember, to commemorate, to face what they survived and who they lost. Think about what that gathering would look like. Maybe it's New Year's Eve, full circle from the air date. Maybe it's the anniversary of the final battle. Maybe it's a memorial service for Hawkins itself, the town that no longer exists except in memory and photographs. The survivors come together and we see immediately who's there and who isn't. The empty chairs would be the most devastating part. Someone's missing from the group. Jonathan's not there because he died in the battle. Or Steve's absent, his sacrifice still a wound that hasn't healed. Or Joyce's chair sits empty, and Will and Jonathan exchange looks that say they're still processing the loss of their mother. Visual storytelling that shows us who was lost without needing dialogue, without needing exposition, just absence made visible. We'd see how the survivors have changed. Mike might be quieter, more serious, carrying the weight of whatever impossible choice he had to make. Dustin might have lost some of his optimism, his jokes landing differently now, tinged with awareness of what laughter costs when you've lost the people who made you laugh. Lucas might still be caring for Max if she survived, or carrying her memory if she didn't. Nancy might be harder, more closed off, protecting herself from future loss by refusing to let anyone get too close. The epilogue would show us that life goes on, but it's not the same life they would have had. They're not the people they would have been without the trauma, without the losses, without the scars. They've built something, found some measure of peace or at least functionality, but the weight of what happened is visible in every interaction, every silence, every moment when someone mentions a memory and has to stop because the person they're remembering isn't there to share it. What's really interesting is how this structure would mirror Stand By Me, one of the key 80s films the Duffers have always cited as inspiration. That film opens with an adult Gordy learning his childhood friend has died, then flashes back to the pivotal summer they spent together, then returns to adult Gordy reflecting on what those friendships meant and how they shaped him. The epilogue acknowledges that childhood ends, that friends drift apart, that the intensity of those early bonds can't be maintained forever, but also that those experiences leave permanent marks on who you become. A Stranger Things epilogue could follow that same pattern, show us the survivors as adults, then flash back to the final battle, then return to the present to show how they've processed it, what they've built, who they've become. It would be bittersweet in the most painful way, showing us victory and loss intertwined, survival and grief coexisting, hope and trauma sharing the same space. The specific details of what we'd see in this epilogue depend on who survives and who doesn't. If Hopper died, we might see Joyce alone, older, still fierce but carrying a weariness that wasn't there before. If Joyce died, we'd see Hopper raising Elle as a single father, their relationship deeper but marked by the absence of the woman who brought them together. If both survived, we'd see them together, but changed, their happiness real but complicated by survivors' guilt, by the knowledge that they got their happy ending when so many others didn't. Elle might be living a normal life, or as normal as she can manage. Maybe she's teaching, using her experiences to help other traumatized kids. Maybe she's working with the government, using her knowledge of the upside down to ensure nothing like it happens again. Maybe she's just trying to be ordinary, to blend in, to pretend she's not marked by what she can do and what she's done. Whether she's with Mike or separated from him would fundamentally change the tone of the epilogue. Together, there's hope. Apart, there's longing that never resolves. Will's fate in the epilogue would reveal whether he ever found peace. Is he still connected to the upside down, still sensing things others can't? Or did closing the gates finally sever that link, leaving him free but also somehow diminished, missing a part of himself he'd learned to live with? His happiness or lack thereof would be the show's final statement on whether trauma can be overcome or just managed, whether healing is possible or if some wounds never close. Dustin, Lucas, Max, if she survived, they'd all carry their own scars, their own losses. We'd see it in how they interact, in what they don't say, in the names they mention carefully or avoid entirely. The party would still exist, but it would be different, smaller, sadder, marked by absence as much as presence. They'd still love each other, but that love would be complicated by shared trauma, by the knowledge that staying close means remembering what you'd rather forget. To be honest, the most devastating version of this epilogue would include a memorial, a physical place where the survivors go to remember the dead. Maybe it's a monument in a rebuilt Hawkins, listing names of those lost. Maybe it's a private gathering at someone's grave. Maybe it's a ritual they've developed, lighting candles or sharing stories or just sitting in silence together. Visual representation of grief that's ongoing, that hasn't ended just because the credits are rolling. The New Year's Eve air date supports this interpretation. New Year's is about reflection, about taking stock of what was and what's coming. An epilogue set on New Year's Eve would have the characters doing exactly that, looking back on what they survived and looking forward to whatever comes next. They'd acknowledge the past without being trapped in it. They'd honour the dead without being consumed by grief. They'd move forward while carrying everything that happened with them. But here's the thing about epilogues. They can offer closure, or they can offer ambiguity. The survivors could be happy, or they could be struggling. The future could look bright, or it could look uncertain. The Duffers could give us a definitive, this is what happened to everyone ending, or they could leave things open, suggesting that life continues beyond what we see, that these characters keep living and changing and dealing with consequences long after we stop watching. Either approach would work, but the bittersweet version feels more true to what Stranger Things has always been about, not clean victories or uncomplicated heroism, but messy survival, complicated grief, and the knowledge that growing up means losing things you can't get back. The epilogue would show us characters who won but paid for it, who survived but were changed, who defeated the monsters but became different people in the process. Life goes on, even after the worst has happened. An epilogue showing the survivors years later would give us closure while acknowledging that trauma doesn't end when the battle does. We'd see who made it, who's still struggling, and most painfully, who's missing from the table. The empty chair at the reunion, the name never spoken aloud because it still hurts too much. That's how you show that some wounds never fully heal. You just learn to live with the scars, learn to function around the absence, learn to build something new on top of the ruins of what was. These heartbreaking theories all share a common thread, though. They're about understanding that victory requires sacrifice, that heroism has costs, and that sometimes the people who saved the world don't get to enjoy the world they saved. And that, my dear friends, is where we'll end tonight's journey into the most heartbreaking theories about Stranger Things Season 5. In future videos, I'll definitely be covering more theories, the hopeful ones, the wild ones, and everything in between. But until next time, keep the lights on, hold your loved ones close, and remember that sometimes the stories that hurt us the most are the ones that matter the most. Stay safe and sweet dreams.